we can get into it.
So, how did you get into this, into symbolism? Was it like Pajot?
Um, yeah, okay, yeah. Sorry, I just had to make sure it was recording. Yeah,
Okay.
so yeah, for me it started out, I guess it started out with Peugeot. I was kind of into Jordan Peterson was popular when I was like 18, so
Yeah, same.
I
How,
kind of
how old are
got
you?
how old I'm 23. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm 26, but
Okay.
I
Yeah.
was, I don't know, all right, 17 when I got to know Jordan Peterson, I guess, first time.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, so I guess it kind of started with him, but kind of got disillusioned with him, and I realized a lot of the things that I liked about him was actually what Jonathan Pageau was talking about.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I'd watch a bunch of Jonathan Pageau videos, and it never really clicked with me. Like sometimes I would kind of like kind of parrot some things that he said, or like things like there. I think a lot of people have this experience when they're watching his videos. Like it makes sense while you're watching it or listening to it, but then you kind of turn it off and you're like, oh, I don't get it. But then I read Language of Creation
Yeah.
by his brother Matthew Pageau, and now it like really clicks with me. And now I'm just like trying to help other people, I guess,
That
get
makes
into
more
it. But
sense.
yeah,
Like, his brother, I think he's a computer scientist by training,
yes, yeah,
and the
right,
book is very like here's the premise, here's what follows from the premise. He kind of looks
yep,
at Genesis in a computer kind of way, computer language kind of way.
right, yeah.
So it makes sense that it would be easier for the physicists, I guess, to understand that way of putting things.
Yeah, I mean, because that's the other thing. Because yeah, so you're saying you're more philosophy background, I'm more physics background.
Oh,
Um,
I have a kind of a science background in during high school,
okay,
and then I never really stopped caring about philosophy of science. But yeah, I
yeah,
was never trained into physics or
right.
chemistry,
But
whatever.
I've kind of noticed the thing about I mean, so the thing about physics, I mean, the holy grail of physics is finding, I guess, like the most fundamental laws of
Yeah.
nature. I mean, that's how it is in modernity, at least. Um, and so there's some things like when I first got into symbolism, I was also getting into scholastic philosophy. It
Mhm.
happened around the same time, just when I was reading these books. And yeah, like you were saying, I kind of noticed if you have I guess if you have a background a little bit of thinking about nature, like these things kind of come easier to you when you're, I guess it's like this form of pattern recognition. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know if you've read or watched Mary Harrington at all. She's on
Yes.
Substack,
Yeah,
but
I know. I love her.
yeah, she's
I met her
talking.
in person actually.
Oh,
We
really?
we had lunch together during a conference a
Oh,
few months
wow.
ago.
Where was this
Yeah.
at?
Was in Cambridge on post-liberalism, and
Oh,
she
nice.
actually she started talking about atomism and kind of Aristotelian forms during
Right.
her talk.
Exactly.
And I went to her and I, because I knew her mostly from the sexual revolution,
Right.
feminism stuff. And I
Hmm.
asked her about this, and she is going down the Aristotelian rabbit hole. She's
Yes.
looking into allomorphism, and we talked about this, and I talked with her about how the social atomism we're living through, and that was one of the topics of the conference because it was on post-liberalism.
Right.
That's sort of the political application of a deeper metaphysics, which is Hobbes' metaphysics, a sort of mechanistic metaphysic
Right.
that sees reality as a bunch of atoms colliding
Right.
without any intrinsic purpose to them.
Right.
Uh, so of course, whatever she was trying to reject politically had a deeper metaphysics, and I think she's now looking
Well,
into that.
this is another thing that I've been trying to look into because I was bringing up her because she was saying, it's like because of the internet, because we see like memes and stuff, we have
Yeah,
this pattern recognition where maybe we can see these more abstract patterns where it's like, okay, if you talk about heaven and earth, maybe I can kind of just literally like look at the shape of it. Like you've seen so many examples that the pattern
yep.
kind of makes itself manifest to you. But the thing about yeah, what she was talking, I totally agree because the thing is that I've started realizing about the relationship between metaphysics and political theory is when one changes, the other changes. It's like whenever people want to make arguments about what is a natural way to govern, they first have to appeal to the way that they see the world, which is going to be
Yeah.
through their metaphysical lens. And if you have like Aristotelian, I mean, like Aristotle, his political theory and his metaphysics, he would use the same terms, right? He would talk about like, society having a certain form or stuff like that.
Yep.
And you would see it wouldn't be this atomistic thing because you would have this top down and this bottom up causation that would kind of live in this harmony. And this is kind of like in my mind, this is kind of how you think about the Catholic social teaching idea of like subsidiarity, where you have
Yeah.
like the smaller part affecting the larger and the larger part affecting the smaller. But yeah, I mean, like you see, whenever liberalism gets really popular, that's when mechanism is kind of worked out, and so people can start making these arguments. You're like, oh, okay, well, if everything is just like these corpuscles kind of hitting each other or something like that, then that's the natural way for society to work. Because the other thing is they kind of see formal cause as like a miracle. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So it's like, okay, what makes a like an atom that's actually made of composite particles. It's made of protons, neutrons, and
Yeah,
electrons.
yeah, yeah.
For the mechanist, they'll say that, it is just like it's just a bunch of particles put together. Like they just have to do that because it's a deterministic theory, right? So they'll say like it has to be set in that way. But with the
Hmm.
Aristotelian version, you can say no, there's something higher that's actually constraining them to be that way. And I really don't think scientifically that there's a case even for the mechanistic view, especially with the example of like an
After
atom.
quantum revolution, yeah.
Exactly right. And so,
Yeah.
right, but that's sort
No,
of
I definitely agree. So there's a bunch in what you said. So going back to the beginning of what you were saying, because that was interesting. Yeah, I think you're right that the internet is giving birth to this new generation that has a sort of uh, built-in capacity to see patterns
right,
that is making Gen Z and maybe some younger millennials, uh, attr it's getting them attracted to ways of thinking that we thought were dead.
right,
And symbolism is an example of that. But this entire religious revival that you're seeing now, it's not. It's not, at least I don't see people in our generation approaching religion the same way their parents were approaching religion when they did.
right,
It's a much more metaphysical way of doing that.
right.
And it's interesting because even like on TikTok, you have all these TikTok witches and people are really into magic,
Hmm.
and that seems to be a part of the same pattern. I don't know if
Yeah.
you know this writer. She's from New York, I believe. She's called Tara Isabella Burton.
No, I haven't heard of her.
She's on Substack as well. She's very good,
Okay.
and she wrote a book called Strange Rites,
Uh-huh.
which is basically on these new religions that the younger generations are approaching and their sort of spirituality. And
Right.
now she's writing a book on Renaissance magic
Mhm.
and how magical thinking seems to be making a comeback in the internet. And
It,
there's a
it,
reason for it, I guess.
it's weird as well. I was thinking about this the other day about because I've been reading tons of my historical, reading is about, for the transition from Middle Ages to modernity. So I read a lot about
Yeah.
the Renaissance from different perspectives. But I didn't realize until super recently because I don't really have any formal education in history. It's just, I read the books. Um, I didn't realize until recently that the whole point of the Renaissance was they were trying to imitate the classics like antiquity.
Yeah.
Like they looked at ancient Rome and ancient Greece and they were like, this is what we want to go for. And it's so funny that actually that is kind of what kicked off modernity in a way.
And
And
scientific thinking, yeah.
right, yeah, but it's so weird that some of the same things happening now where I see people, I mean, I'm one of those people where I'm like, the Middle Ages were cool, like we should take some stuff from, into Thomistic Aristotelian philosophy, into maybe some of the ways of storytelling and
Hmm.
some of the theology that they had. I think some of that stuff's cool. And it's like, it's kind of going that way again. But again, the Renaissance was when magic was really popular. I don't know. There's kind of that same pattern going on. I don't really know what to think
Well,
of it, but
there's a parallel between magical thought and scientific thought that
oh
people
yeah,
usually see as completely distinct, kind of opposites, but
right,
they're really not, especially if you think in sort of Baconian terms. So
right,
the Francis Bacon idea that knowledge is power,
right,
magic is power. So the idea is that you're kind of gathering the lower basal material elements
right,
in accordance to your will, and then you're
right,
doing stuff in accordance with your will. Uh, and science is in many ways it's similar. That's why I think there's a common critique of, for instance, the exploitation of nature
right,
by industry and science from both the very lefty kind of mystical people and then
right,
the very sort of conservative right-wing Catholics.
right,
So, like Chesterton, for instance, all of them are against that because they see this scientific thought as this attempt to create a machine and to see the universe as a machine.
Right.
That's a very alchemical way of thinking.
Right.
One of the ideas of these uh, magicians, etc., was to create a being, to create a sort of machine that would act like a human being. And
Right.
with AI, we are still living through that.
Right.
Uh, so that's still part of our narrative as a culture, to be honest, this
Yeah, a
clash
thousand
between
percent.
magic and science.
Yeah, it's like I don't know if you've seen, I forget, maybe it is An Abolition of Man. I don't remember. I forget. I
Yeah.
get the C.S. Lewis books mixed up sometimes, but um he has this idea of like science and religion and technology and science. And he says that there's two ways that you could organize this. You could see um, science as akin to technology and then religion as akin to magic. But he argues that the right way to actually reorient those things is to attach magic with technology and science with
Hmm.
religion, because one's about understanding the world and the other's about controlling the world. And yeah, I mean it's definitely connected. And the other thing as well, I've been trying to research this, but I haven't found too much evidence because, Francis Bacon, for instance, he was, he's popular for stuff like uh, the Novum Organum. My
Yeah.
Latin's really bad, or the New Atlantis and stuff like that. But he has a wealth of text analyzing fairy tales,
Yep.
and I've always
There's
kind of
this theory that he was a Shakespeare. You know that theory?
he was Shakespeare.
Yeah. There's all these debates on who
Oh,
Shakespeare was because
right.
there's not many data on the actual Shakespeare person. And one of the most famous theories is that Francis Bacon was Shakespeare.
Okay.
Um, so
I
yeah,
haven't
he
heard
went
that
all
one.
the way from literary man to the proto-scientific
Right.
scientific guy. Yeah.
Right. But he would I read briefly his commentary on the myth of Prometheus, and
Hmm.
just the way that he was talking about his understanding, my understanding of magic at the time. I started to wonder, he lived in the Renaissance. I wonder if he practiced magic. And there's been some debate on this. I've seen some papers where people kind
Hmm.
of made a case because, he was never public about it. But it seems like, during that time, there might have been a chance. But the other thing is,
Well, just so we one more example of this. I don't
yeah,
know if you know about this, but Descartes was also one of the other figures of creating this mechanized,
right.
scientized way of looking at the world. He spent his entire life trying to become a Rosicrucian. I'm not sure if he ever got to do it, but
Can you remind me what I've heard that term. I forget what they are.
it was also a sort of hermetical
Okay.
secret order,
Right.
sort of like the Freemasons and all that.
Gotcha.
And he spent his entire life trying to become a part of them. Uh,
Interesting.
yeah. So no, these I think that part of what happened to me at least, and I think that's probably the best way to look at these stuff, is in some way to disenchant magic and to enchant what we see as nature. And
Right.
then you understand both better, and
Hmm.
you get to a sort of middle ground that avoids the problems of both of them. So what I
Right.
mean by disenchanting magic is understanding that what these people were trying to do is not really Harry Potter
Right.
spell casting stuff.
Right.
It's not really that. You have to understand that nature for them was more enchanted in the sense that it was not this mechanized atoms bumping into each other
Right.
thing. It was much more Aristotelian, and that's why I think recovering this Aristotelian view of nature kind of gives you the middle way between both extremes already.
Exactly.
Because if you have forms embedded in nature,
Right.
you have a sort of magic to things. As you said, there's a sort of magic to forms, and quantum mechanics, for instance, makes us think in magical terms again. Like,
Right.
how do these entangled, does this entangled system ever go classical?
Yeah.
That's a sort of these gaps in nature that we thought weren't there, that we thought we had it all figured out. That
Yeah.
seems to be making a case for something like forms again, or
Right.
something informing stuff from above.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think the thing about, yeah, that's interesting. You say there's some kind of magic in forms because as a person trying to make the scientific case for Aristotelianism, I'm like, hold up.
No,
But I
no,
think
me too. I don't think they're magic all the way down. It's
right.
just that So sorry for talking too much, but
No,
in
no,
the
no.
philosophy of people who are close to the Aristotelian camp
Yeah.
are the emergentists, and
Mhm.
these guys will use the word emergence to describe all sorts of phenomena, but especially, for instance, in quantum physics,
Right.
they will explain uh, um, oh, what's the right term? When something starts, when you disentangle an entangled system. Decoherence.
Oh, right.
That kind. So they will usually explain it as emergence,
Mm.
uh, or for instance, when applied to the philosophy of mind, they will say that consciousness is an emergent property of
Right.
your biological or psychological things.
And it's always
System.
a fill-in for we have no idea what happened.
Yeah, it's a fill-in for magic. They're
Yeah, right,
basically
right,
saying it's
right,
just I don't know. We don't know what happens, but it
right,
emerges as if it
right,
explains anything. Uh,
right. But I mean, it's definitely this, yeah, I mean, I hesitate to call it magic because to me it seems like, yes, exactly. Magic is kind of the thing that you don't really understand exactly all the details of the causes,
mhm.
that make one thing happen. And I think that there could be, I mean, the thing is that all of these emergent properties, they're only emergent if you take a mechanistic view of nature. Like
Yes.
if you have to have an explanation, I think it actually becomes less magic if you become Aristotelian because if you have to have
Yes.
an explanation that's from, the smallest constituent parts, like that's the only explanation that's going to satisfy you, then yeah, you're going to have to appeal to magic. But if you can say, okay, if you have this kind of Cartwright view where it's like you have the dappled world and okay,
Hmm.
um, this Nobel Prize winner, I had to read this for one of my classes recently. He wrote, I think it's
Laughlin?
huh?
Is it
Anderson.
Robert Laughlin? No, okay, okay. Who
Yeah,
is
I
the?
forgot his first name, but his last name's Anderson. He wrote this paper called More is Different. And
Ah,
he
yeah, yeah.
yeah, and he's
That's
a
an amazing
really,
paper.
yeah, very well-respected condensed matter physicist.
Yep.
And he was making the case because, he's studying kind of the intermediate part of nature. He's not looking at the fundamental particles like the particle physicist. He's looking at these systems. That's what condensed matter is.
Hmm.
And he was making this argument that yeah, you can't like the fact that you think that a fundamental description has to come from just fundamental particles, like that's the problem. Unless when you do that, you're going to get stuff like magic. If you treat it like itself, if you say, okay, if you have two fundamental particles, they're going to act this one way. But I mean, really, if you just let yourselves talk about forms and essences, then you can start describing the causal powers, and it's way easier. You don't have to appeal to this emergent thing. But there's kind of this tension, which I understand because it's really nice when you can explain things from constituent particles.
Hmm.
Like that's really powerful. I mean, and from a Baconian view, that's kind of our goal of science, but I understand why you would want to have that explanatory power.
Well,
But
I think our goal in general, like our generations and future generations' goal, is to harmonize both things because
right,
sometimes these narratives that see the emergence of modernity and modern science as pure decadence,
right,
they don't see they don't even recognize that it was not as if there was an invasion from outside and people from outside kind of obliged us to become modern. No,
right,
like the medievals became modern because of their own internal tensions.
right,
If you look at late scholasticism, it was already a
right.
precursor in many ways to what
With
then
Occam,
became
William of
modern
Occam.
thought. Yeah.
Yeah,
So it's not as if there was this invasion from outside and we were forced to become like this. No, we became
right.
like this because of all the problems and contradictions within our own system.
Well,
And
I mean, the other thing is so I recently gave a talk at the University of Steubenville, and it was a great talk. I was
yeah.
very honored to be there. But they're a really good philosophy program. They're kind of known for their philosophy and theology. And I was basically given a talk about more or less my paper about the Thomistic interpretation of quantum
Mhm.
mechanics. And I was kind of trying to make a scientific case for, you know, why we should go back to Aristotelian philosophy of nature. And
Mhm.
because these philosophers, they're so solid, they were like, well, I know the philosophy. Why would I need your science? And I was like, right. I mean, and I'm happy that they're there because I'm trying to convince, people that metaphysics is important. Um, but you could also see sometimes where if you live in that environment and you find a scientific fact, like you find an empirical fact, and like because of your philosophical system, you don't try to integrate it, within your system. I would understand doing a Francis Bacon and say like, hey, if we deviate from what we observe in nature, then that's a problem. And okay,
Yeah,
yeah, and
of
if you
course
take
it
that,
is.
yeah,
No, it's a sort of it's a sort of defensive view
hmm
that these people like Bacon were criticizing, and they were correct in criticizing because they are in their own ivory towers,
right,
sort of metaphysical ivory towers, and they don't want to look at the world, and it's only because of fear. It's because they have they're fearful that if we look at the sciences, my metaphysical system will crumble.
right,
But if you're not fearsome, uh, maybe your system is wrong. There's so for instance, I'm sorry if I'm going to take a small detour, but
fine,
in early Christianity, like the Church Fathers, there was this debate on whether or not we should read the pagans,
hmm
and people like Justin Martyr made the case that yeah, of course we should read the philosophers
hmm
because because we have the truth,
hmm
and whatever they can give us, it will also be true because we have the truth. As a person, in that case, we have the person of Christ with us. We'll be
right,
able to see what's truthful in their systems as well. We shouldn't be afraid of them
right,
because truth is on our side. And I think that if you're, let's say, Thomas or whatever, and you truly think that you have the right system on your side, why should you be afraid of looking at the sciences?
right,
I just I don't get their thing. And in fact, we are probably living in the best era in the last 200 years to be a sort of classical metaphysician and to look at the sciences
right,
because
a
now
thousand
more than
percent,
ever
right,
the outcomes are closer and closer to what you believe.
yes,
And but some people are. That's what this is one of my problems with the early 2010s atheists versus theists debate,
hmm
like Dawkins and Hitchens and all these against the theists, and that was kind of a Dawkins atheist for a while. Is that they were both quite the worst versions of each other. So
mm,
you have sort of the most stereotypically mechanistic atheists on one side, and then on the other side, the theists who were very anti-science, anti-evolution,
right,
whatever.
right.
Uh, and you create these false dichotomies. And I think that till this day, you have some Thomists, for instance, who still think that I can't look at the sciences because if I do, I will become a mechanist or whatever,
Yeah,
or a dirty evolutionary theorist or whatever.
right.
And it doesn't have to be that way. And the sciences don't look like that
Right.
now.
There
Uh,
is a thing in which I understand. It's hard to reconcile when you don't when you're looking into one field that you don't understand. And I mean, pretty much everybody. I mean, not a lot of there's some people in physics that think about philosophy, but people kind of default adopt the mechanistic viewpoint because
yeah.
it's what we've been. I mean, I hear people all the time. They make mechanistic comments whether or not they realize it. Even like people that primarily work in quantum mechanics, they make mechanistic uh, comments. Um, but it is hard, if you're if you're like an incredible Thomist and you've studied Thomism, Aristotelian metaphysics, trying to look at a physics textbook and it's written by mechanists and you don't really have the means to defend yourself or maybe see gaps where your theory could fit. Because the thing is, even to this day, classical mechanics, I mean, because it works, is
Mhm.
explained in very mechanistic terms. And I have reasons that I could give why you can get away with the mechanistic terms there. But
Yes.
there's some gaps now, especially with our understanding of quantum mechanics. If you take an Aristotelian approach to quantum mechanics, there's a lot of things that you can retroactively go back and look at classical mechanics and say, oh, we can actually describe it like this. You can
Hmm.
describe it in this quantum way. And there's even cases to be made for questioning things like determinism in classical mechanics. Because
Yeah.
if there was some kind of indeterminism in classical mechanics and we could calculate it in the way that we can quantum mechanics, it's really small. And it kind of runs into the whole epistemic ontic debate. Like, will you actually ever be able to measure these things that are so small, these small discrepancies? But again, there's no money in these kinds of experiments because it would be very expensive to run these experiments where you could see discrepancies in classical
Yeah.
mechanics, and that's not what you get grant funding for. So,
But
um,
I think that only deepens the what people like Thomas. I'm kind of a half Thomist. I'm kind of Thomistic when it comes to the philosophy of nature, not really when it comes to theology. I'm more with the Capetocians when it comes to
okay,
theology.
yeah,
But either way, um, uh, if you're like a Thomist about philosophy of nature and you have this problem, then okay, I believe that mechanism or the sort of mechanistic view of looking at things is wrong. But why does it work? You have to explain why it works. And I
I
think you can explain why it works
right.
in Thomistic terms. You can basically say that
It's all
they
accidental forms.
yeah, they're focusing on quantities and accidents.
Right.
You could say that, and but you have to find a way to integrate everything. And as you were pointing out, because even if you do physics all the way down, let's say, if you go to quantum phenomena, a
Hmm.
mechanism kind of dissolves. So I don't think we should be afraid just to look at reality and to look at what the data is showing you,
Right.
uh, because data is just data. It has to be interpreted, and why do you? And this belief that it has to be interpreted mechanistically was always a preconception. It was never a given, and
Right.
I think that in the last 100 years, but in the last 50 years, more and more, we're understanding that the mechanistic lens is actually blinding us to all sorts of phenomena. And
Right.
not just in physics, especially in the higher level sciences. Like in biology, for instance, it's very common for people to talk in teleological terms. They will instead use words like teleonomy or whatever, but
Right.
final causes are back.
Right.
And they seem
Yeah.
to be reducible. Like there doesn't seem to be a way to do good biology without them.
Yeah.
And the same goes for chemistry, biochemistry for sure. Um,
Especially, I mean, with um evolution, I mean, I don't know how you describe that except for teleological terms. I mean, evolution is a teleological theory. You're actually your final cause is maximizing your chances of survival. And
yeah.
yeah, it's the other thing that's
No,
really
no, it's just that even the old biological paradigm, it
yeah,
was kind of like physics in a way it approached stuff. It was very mechanistic. So you had gene pools. You basically created these models where you had gene pools, and you instead of looking at individual organisms or or Aristotelians would call substances, you
right,
would look at these highly abstract gene pools and
right,
how the genes would navigate through the gene pool, and that's how
hmm
we would make biological theory. Well,
right,
nowadays the organism is back because we are understanding that morphology and
right,
sort of the higher level constrains the genetic level in various
yes,
ways.
right,
Uh, and that was unexpected from a mechanical point of view, but it
absolutely,
happened. So
yeah,
it was sort of an Aristotle's revenge, to use
yeah,
the famous term.
yeah, right,
But that seems to be happening in all sorts of areas.
yeah. I think another place because I've kind of heard the biological arguments and I've seen them and be like, yeah, that makes sense. I'm not a biologist. I'm not super interested in biology, so I've kind of read the couple papers. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. But I think the other thing is because yeah, I don't see a lot of people pointing this out in physics because again, I think quantum mechanics is pretty clear. But the other things like information theory, I think is kind
Mhm.
of a return of formal cause because it's this idea of you know, say that you have a song, for example. There's many ways that you can represent a song. There's many different materials that you can use to represent a song. You could play the song, say it's your guitar, a guitar and your voice. You could play the song and then you could hear it. That would be the same thing, or you could transcribe it on a computer and musical notation, or you could put it over the radio waves. But it's all the song. It has the same information,
Yep.
and and in the past, I don't know, 20 years or so, uh, in physics, I mean, people have been going crazy over quantum information theory, and it's given us
Hmm.
lots of strides. I mean, there's been things that we didn't expect, like we learned some things about black holes just by studying the information theory of black holes, where we're literally just looking at, yeah, how much information can be encoded in this type of material, to use
Hmm.
Aristotelian terms, and this type of material, and how they communicate with each other. And we've been figuring out a lot about the world just using those.
So, just help me understand the point. So, you think that information itself works like a kind of a form, or is it more that the information is shaped by the higher level and how you understand it and how you put it to work?
So, I mean, I guess I would say that information is a type of form in a way. I mean,
Hmm.
like in every stage of how you communicate the song, you have to give it some type of consistent form, but you can use
Hmm.
different types of material to represent that. And if
Oh,
you
okay.
if you really just focus on the form, like the way that you want to represent this thing on many different devices or different mediums, that's kind of where information theory is. It's
Huh.
kind of interesting if you read information theory. Um, we have we've kind of agreed upon to model everything as binary bits, so we're very partial to the digital representation of form. But I mean, it still gets us somewhere. It seems like it's so funny because it's almost like we can't deal with abstract forms. It kind of shows that like you can't really have form without matter. So we had to pick one. We had to
Yep.
pick binary, and it works pretty well. Um, but I mean, there's ways that you can translate that. It's I don't know if you've heard any of these facts before, but people will say um like one example I can think of is people talk about different languages, their information density,
Mhm.
and they'll give a measurement in terms of bits typically. Like they'll say like, oh, you have this many megabytes of data per second. And the reason they
Yeah.
do that is because everybody kind of agreed to use binary for information theory. But um it's a bit of
Yeah,
a
I know some of those. There are some people. Information theory is making its way to philosophy of mind, and there
yeah,
are people who are trying to measure consciousness through its quantity of information, basically.
right.
Um,
Oh yeah,
uh,
integrated information theory.
yeah,
Oh my gosh, dude. Oh my gosh. Don't even get me started on integrated information theory. This one is really interesting to me because I think this is another Aristotle's revenge.
yeah.
Because the idea of integrated information theory, they'll say that, okay, you have two systems A and B. And
Hmm.
they'll say, okay, the way that you know A and B are integrated, they have integrated information is when you move A, B moves, and when you move B, A moves. Like you can't separate, they're kind of entangled in a way.
Entangled, yeah.
And it seems to me that all they're discovering is that there's a substantial form of the body.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
there's these
No,
substantial
I
forms of
fully
these higher
agree.
levels, yeah, that are
I
that
fully
are
agree, but you
necessary for
have to know your
consciousness.
metaphysics before, because these people, when they describe it, they will still try to describe it in a very
Right,
quantitized, let's say, quantitative way, the
right,
sort of mechanized way.
right,
Uh, it's clear in the philosophy of mind because what they're trying to do is effectively to reduce mind or to try to explain away mind.
right.
But they seem to just be reinstating it and to
Yeah,
say that it sort of shapes the matter uh, from its inception, which
yeah,
is another interesting thing that you point out on your article on this, is that w w one of the great things, this is not something I think you say there, but it's related. One of the great things that changed with the birth of modernity and the the sort of twilight of the Middle Ages was our way of conceptualizing matter.
right.
Matter wasn't something that you could touch for a
Yeah,
while. In Aristotle, the sort of course, pure matter, it's prime matter, uh, and then you have, of course, whatever. It doesn't matter. All the the minutiae here, but matter was seen as potential for form, and
right.
then with the scientific revolution, matter gets reified and it becomes a sort of substratum, a physical substratum, which is the ultimately real. Actually, it's the actually real
Yes.
from where
Yeah,
everything
all
gets
matters
built up.
actualized at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, everything is actualized. It's a sort of it's
It's a
interesting
return to
because it's
monism.
in a way, it's a sort
Yeah,
of atomism in the way they put it, but
right,
it's also very monistic. So
right.
both ends of Greek philosophy meet there
Yes,
in a weird way. But potency was expelled from the world in general.
exactly.
And but it just seems that I'm not sure that in the 19th century, like I'm not even sure that with gravity, our idea of matter, that mechanized view of matter wasn't already displaced by the time of Newton. But whatever.
Right,
So this is interesting. This is something that I learned doing my master's. Leibniz, for instance, was very against the idea of gravity, and he wanted physicists to do away with it. And the main reason for that is that he saw gravity as a sort of magical force that
right,
was being imposed on this new mechanistic way of looking at the world.
right,
And he saw that if we were to explain things in a purely mechanical way, we couldn't have gravity as
right.
a fundamental force. So that's already a problem within the system. But by the
Well,
time
that's been fixed though.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, with general relativity, it has to have this local character.
Yes,
Yeah, right.
Einstein kind of revenges
Yes,
Newton here.
exactly. He revenged. Yeah, he's kind of the poster child of mechanism. Well, not really,
But at
but
the
I
same
guess in the
time, this
later.
is
Yeah,
yeah, no, no, but it's interesting because at the same time this is happening,
right,
you are in a way Einstein is kind of helping you make fulfill the stream of mechanizing matter, but at the
right.
same time, quantum mechanics is destroying that dream.
Yes,
So I think again we have a room for potency in the world, uh,
absolutely.
and for understanding the fundamental as potential, and also if you have these Aristotelian lens, I think Rob Koons talks about this. Uh, you should expect the quantum world to be weird
Exactly.
because it's closer to potential, but the
Right.
potentiality is not determined. So,
Yeah.
and because there's no determinacy there, you should expect very weird things to happen.
Yeah.
Uh,
Since we're on this topic, I would like to maybe pick your brain a little bit about prime
yeah.
matter.
Okay.
Because so yeah, exactly. I've made this point, and other people have made the point that the quantum, it's closer to potentiality, because it's closer to prime matter. But the weird thing about prime matter is people have had so many debates. I've seen, for me as a physicist, the way that I kind of see the world, I would see energy as prime matter. I would think that's a great candidate for prime matter.
Yep.
But there's a lot of Thomist Aristotelians that argue against that, um, because they'll say that prime matter can't be determined in a way, like it can't have a quantity. And
Yes.
so sometimes it's frustrating to me because I'm like, okay, it seems like we're talking about something that's not real. And maybe that's a bit of a scientific
But
bias
I
because
think
I'm
they
like,
say that. I think most. So this is a lively debate within
yeah,
Thomas. They wouldn't say it. They would say it's not real in the
mm,
sense of being a reified material thing or stuff.
right.
And that's why I think energy is very helpful as a analogy, as a sort of
Right, because
physical analogy
I've been
to
thinking,
prime
I mean,
matter.
like as a long-term goal of me trying to kind of repackage modern physics in
Hmm.
Aristotelian terms, I'm like, well, I kind of want to call it neo-Aristotelian metaphysics so I can redefine what prime matter is because this thing
Many people are
frustrates
doing
me
that,
so
yeah.
much. Yeah, it's like, but I also realize as well, and I think you'll find this interesting. Um, not Aquinas, Augustine had
Hmm.
this notion of earth. He writes of it in the Confessions, where he's trying
Hmm.
to understand Genesis, the first chapter of Genesis. And he's saying it's like completely undeterminate matter. So he kind of right there lays out the idea of prime matter. Of course, Aristotle had this idea, and he presumably read Aristotle, but he kind of identifies this Earth being without form and void. He identifies that with prime matter in the
Oh
Confession.
yeah, that's I think that's everywhere in the tradition. The sort of analogy between heaven and earth and heaven and form and then earth and matter is
Right,
everywhere there.
exactly.
But even
But
in Genesis, there's this sense that the void is really it doesn't exist. It's a sort of
yes,
you need it to formalize your system,
exactly.
let's say,
Yes,
but without heaven, it's never actualized, and it's
exactly.
exactly the same way with prime matter. So what I would say to you is that the energy analogy is extremely helpful, at least for me,
Yep.
and it's probably one of the best ways to make this work in
Hmm.
contemporary terms.
Right.
But at the same time, you should always acknowledge the specific difference here, which seems to be that, as you said, energy is a quantity in a way. You
Yes.
can measure it. So you could
But
say that it's very close to pure potentiality,
right.
but it's still not pure potentiality. And pure potentiality, prime matter in these systems acts as a principle, which, as if to say, it's not something that you should find in the world at all.
Right.
They actually expect you not to find it in the world. It's a metaphysical principle,
Well,
just as you can't find pure forms.
exactly,
Well,
because
angels
this is the
supposedly, but
thing
yeah.
that kind of made me realize because I responded to the one of the comments that you made to me on Substack saying, you're saying you should identify heaven and earth with matter and form. I was like, I'm working
Yeah.
on it right now. The thing that made me start doing this is the realization that it seems to me that Aquinas, when he's talking about prime matter, even though, I'm not an expert on Thomas Aquinas. I've read some books, but I'm not,
Yeah.
it's not my field. Um, it seems to me, even though he uses it sometimes in his analytic philosophy to, kind of make arguments, it seems to him that it mostly holds a mythic character, like in the
Yeah, in a
same,
way.
yeah, and like in
It's a
this,
principle. I think that that's the best way to understand it because mythical can sound quite derogative.
yeah,
It's a
but
principle. It's a metaphysical principle, just like
yeah,
form. So I think we have a more difficult time conceiving of prime matter because we already have this sense that matter should be physical.
right,
But pure form doesn't exist either. It does in Aquinas, it's the angels. But either way,
right.
for other
But but
medievals,
but just to
angels are not
real
pure
quick, just
form.
to yeah, exactly. But just to barge in for a second, it seems like he has these categories of heaven and earth,
Yeah,
but he's giving them prime matter and angel or God for him because God is pure
yeah,
actualization. And so for him, it's like he has heaven and earth, but he does all of his science. He talks about everywhere in between, but he
yeah.
keeps the metaphysical principles. So he understands these heavens and earth. So the thing about scholastic metaphysics is you can explain science in these terms. Mostly, you might have to make a couple adjustments. You might have to call it neoclassical, redefine exactly what a fundamental, you might have like neoprime matter, you would call it something like energy. You
Yeah.
can have these and you can keep your mythic, symbolic kind of categories. Like they become real at that point. Like you actually
Hmm.
see how because this is Thomas Aquinas' five ways. Basically, what he's doing is he's just taking a metaphysical category, a metaphysical principle, and he's taking it to its end, and then he says, this is what we call God, you know?
Yep.
And so if you see stuff like actuality, and you can just say, okay, well, how does an atom work? You have this form that actualizes this potential. Okay, well, then what actualize that? And you can just go all the way up. It becomes to where I can look into a lab and I can see how something works and I can see how the consequence of that working leads me to understanding what I mean by God. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's even and I think it's not just amicable to the sciences. It's the best way we have of joining them together, which
Right.
that's why I'm writing on the unity of science. Because
Yes.
in very broad strokes, if you have this idea, it's way easier to explain the emergence, let's say, of new forms at higher levels and why
Yeah.
things behave in so many different ways.
Yeah.
Because so if you think that the fundamental, let's say, the lower level is already fully actualized, why should new things emerge?
Right.
Why should we ever get out of the, let's say, quantum realm, let alone the realm of particles?
Right.
But if you have this view that they are just potential in neither form, it's way easier for you to understand that, yeah, of course, vegetative forms should emerge, and then animal forms should emerge, and the world should be sort of layered in the way that it seems to be,
Yeah. That's
because
that's
they're pure potential.
right.
And that seems, to me at least, to give you a much better cosmology in the ancient sense, not in a physics sense nowadays,
Right.
where you have an integrated worldview
Right.
that is very amicable to the sciences. It's not in contradiction with it. In fact,
Exactly.
it helps you understand them better.
Right.
What seems to be mysterious ceases to be mysterious.
Right.
Emergence becomes forms, and that's way easier.
Yeah, exactly.
It's easier to make sense of form than emergence, I
Yeah.
think.
I think though, but earlier when we were saying kind of why did mechanism work so well? Because this is kind of one of the
Hmm.
tensions because the scientific revolution, what we call a scientific revolution, is really the advent of mechanism, and
Yeah.
we're deciding, okay, we're going to go with that. And it worked swimmingly. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we know pretty well. Um, but I think, you know, there was maybe part of the way that Aristotelianism was working at the time where um, sometimes it's not really clear like what's an accidental form and what's a substantial form. And we were calling too many things substantial forms that were accidental forms. And you could
Hmm.
actually reduce them, to the sum of their parts, and you could see these geometric quantities and kind of like what Descartes talks about. Um, and I think that we weren't necessarily pushing the limits of questioning exactly
Yeah.
Aristotelian stuff lies. But I think now that we have a mechanistic view, like you said, we're at a really good time to really integrate these two. And we can, I think like the study of fundamental physics should be, does this thing have an accidental form or a substantial form? And there's ways that I presume there's mathematical ways that we could try to measure that, like things about integrated information theory. If you see
Yeah.
two parts and you see that you can't causally disconnect them, then you could say, okay, well that's one good reason to think that this has a substantial form, you know?
Yeah, I
Like,
fully agree. In fact, so in philosophy for the last 40 years, Aristotle has been making a comeback, and it
right.
started in ethics. So
Yeah.
mostly virtue ethics was
Yeah.
where Aristotle started making a comeback. But very soon, and by the time this was happening, metaphysics was sort of a no-no. No one was doing metaphysics. Everyone thought that metaphysics was buried already.
Right.
You had this naturalized way of doing philosophy. But then
Right.
in the 80s and 90s, metaphysics started making a comeback, and all of a sudden you had neo-Aristotelian metaphysics.
Right.
So people were not just thinking that Aristotle was useful for doing ethics, this sort of
Mhm.
practical stuff.
Mhm.
They started to implement some of his thought into actual metaphysics and actual philosophy. And nowadays you have a broad camp of neo-Aristotelian philosophers. So why am I saying this? It's just I think that in many ways, this resurgence, this revival happened because of the old paradigm showing its own contradictions. So, what
Right.
happened in the scientific revolution, to use sort of, you know, John Vervaeke,
Yeah.
yeah, to use this term, is that we severely narrowed down our relevance realization,
Right.
our attention. So, whereas before you had this sort of cosmical attention where you were trying to understand everything,
Right.
what people like Galileo is doing this in his own terms. He's asking us to forget about qualities like the redness of an apple, the smell of an apple, and let's focus on the quantities.
Right.
Let's mathematize everything. So you are basically uh, funneling down attention to just one small portion of reality, and that, of course, that can give you amazing strength.
Right.
That will your knowledge of that aspect of reality will become much more precise, and it will get you this ability to control nature in ways that were unprecedented.
Right.
Uh, and I think that that's what happened in the scientific revolution. We sort
Right.
of we got these goggles that only saw quantities and sort of Cartesian planes
Right.
with points of matter in them,
Right.
and then we got that paradigm and we took it to its logical end.
Right.
And when we tried to use that paradigm to understand the things that the paradigm was showing us, like quantum stuff, in the case of biology, for instance, so this is another interesting example, is that biology was never mechanized. If you look
Right.
even in the 18, 19, 17, 18, 19th century, there
Yeah,
was
despite all the
always this
attempts, never
these
really worked.
debates
Right.
of mechanizing biology.
Right.
For Descartes, animals were just machines. But everyone knew that that wasn't quite right.
Right.
And that's why you had vitalism, for instance, the idea that you have a sort of vital force
Right.
animating matter in the
Yeah.
case of biology. Whatever. So it was this mechanized view of nature was never fully integrated into all the sciences, and
Right.
it was inevitable that it would come to a point where it would its own problems would show up. And I think that's what happened when, with the quantum revolution, of course, but then in the 40s and 50s, as psychology becomes this bigger and bigger science, people are trying to understand consciousness now.
Right.
Uh, and that's another big problem because within this picture that we now have, we can't make sense of consciousness at all. And
Yeah.
all these higher level stuff that we could just ignore
Right.
made a comeback. So
Right.
life in biology, consciousness, and philosophy of mind, and all that, and even in physics,
Right.
as you've been saying,
Yeah,
all these stuff came back.
it's happening. It's happening in ways that people maybe don't even understand in physics as well. Like I do nuclear physics, so
Hmm.
it's kind of in between of the fundamental and, the more macroscopic. So we're looking at, nuclei, like constituents of protons and neutrons. And I was at a workshop a few weeks ago called Collective Phenomena in Nuclei.
Yeah.
And the weird thing about nuclei, maybe less known knowledge is nuclei are rarely spherical. They're
Okay.
usually like football shaped or cigar shaped. We call it prolate or oblate. And you can't explain that necessarily by appealing to, individual particles. They call it collective motion. And even
Hmm.
like our attempts to model nuclei based on the fundamental forces, like you can model you technically could model nuclei from fundamental like quark interactions, but that's too computationally intensive. So we use these things called effective field theories that use these field theory principles like used in fundamental physics. Um, but we make our fundamental particles protons and neutrons in that case. And even if we just try to use the forces from few body scattering, like just a couple protons and neutrons, and extrapolate, right now, I mean, I'm not going to say that there's not a case where eventually it could be made because, this is an open question. But right now, it seems like we can't explain these collective phenomena
Hmm.
without looking at these
The
higher
whole in
order.
general. Yeah.
Exactly. We have to get these phenomena that happen at these higher levels, basically.
Yeah.
And we see all these collective, like the other thing is very
Uh,
practically, like when I have to do a calculation for a certain nucleus, and there's quantum field theory arguments why this happens, but like practically we can't do it any other way.
mm.
And again, I'm trying to put a lot of asterisks because I mean this could change. Science is very shifty. People think
Yeah, of
science
course.
is like concrete knowledge. It's very shifty. But like right now, the way that we have to do calculations is if I have a nucleus and it's made of 12 protons and neutrons, in order to get a complete description of that nucleus, there will be a 12 proton neutron force. Like there will be a force that can only be described if you put in all of the protons and neutrons. And it's very small, so we don't usually use it. We can do pretty well with one and two and three. Um, but it's stuff like that where you're seeing like, okay, there's not that much alternative. And the quantum field theory folks are saying, all these fundamental particle folks are saying, well, if we just had a big enough supercomputer, then we could model everything. But we actually don't know if that's true. That's just an assumption.
Yes, yes,
Could turn
exactly.
it could turn out to be true. I don't know, but it's an assumption, and we're doing fine without them. I mean,
Exactly. No,
yeah.
I think, well, so some philosophers in this camp, I mean, Aristotelian inclined, very anti-reductionistic people, will
Yeah,
say that what those guys are arguing for is a mere dogma, sort of a physicalist dogma. That
right,
no, we have to understand it in even if we can't now. One day, when we have the sort of complete theory, or whenever we have a supercomputer or knowledge of all the variables, we'll be able to do it from the bottom up.
yeah.
And I think that's wrong, but they have a point in the sense that history has backed them up until now.
Well,
As you said, there's this sense in which we have been able to track down the how the most elemental elements kind of build up everything above them.
right,
But I don't think either. So this is where I think we should always try to harmonize stuff. I don't think that should be unexpected from an Aristotelian way of viewing stuff. So I don't think that if you accept forms, you should accept that there are gaps in physics or whatever. No,
right.
there should be a continuum of physical course of physical
Yeah,
causes, of course.
yeah,
Even like now, I'm moving my hand up and down, and I think that a good description of this can be done in conscious terms, that I want
right,
to raise up my hand, but there surely is also a physical description of what is happening in the atoms that make up my hand, and they
right.
should be continuous. I don't think that's.
Well, I don't know. The
I
thing
think
about
that the great. Sorry, just to finish
okay,
my thought. It's just
yeah,
I think that if you a good Aristotelian should be able to embrace the best of physicalism in the
right,
sense that you should be able to explain how matter, let's say, is physically continuous, but also, and this is crucial, how it is determined by form or something
right.
higher. Uh,
The thing about the continuous thing, I don't know. I kind of hesitate at that because it
okay.
seems like the actualization of a potential is typically in Aristotelian thought a an instantaneous phenomenon.
Yeah, of course.
Well, and there's other things in physics which we have a hard time describing, like phase transitions. Going from
Oh
a
no, no.
state.
What I meant by continuous is not this in the sort of uh, um, uh, in between levels way. I mean, what I meant is that, so for instance, some people who argue against some physicalists
Yeah,
pose this argument against emergentists, maybe Aristotelians, that this view presupposes top-down causation. And their
right,
problem with top-down causation is that you would have to pose a sort of physical force interfering in the basal, in the lowest level forces in
right.
ways that seem counterintuitive. And
Right.
I think they're right. Like, if you conceive of what the form is doing in those terms, you are thinking in efficient terms. You think that a form works matter
Right.
through
And through
efficient means,
physicalist, yeah,
which is
exactly.
wrong. Like,
Right.
you already have a mechanized view of form. That's not how
Yes.
what happens. What happens is that you should expect a continuum of physical causes in the sense that they are not disturbed in a physical way. They are just determined
Oh,
formally.
I see what
They
you
are
mean.
informed, let's say.
Right.
And informing stuff is not touching stuff or
Right.
whatever. Uh,
No, I
and
see
that's
what
a
you
very important point, I guess.
right. And so that's interesting though, because so you're saying that we should have this continuum in the way that you describe
Yep.
of causes, but the thing is that with the current paradigm, that's not really what we're interested in because we're interested in laws
Yes.
right now. And this is
Yes.
yeah, this is another one of the reasons that we wanted to talk because um I've been looking into history and theory of natural laws and kind of trying to argue for more essentialism, powers causation instead of
Hmm.
laws. Um, and it does seem to me like there's so many things about laws are really powerful whenever you have them. There's some laws that seem almost fundamental. And I say almost, and we can get into this. This would be a very big digression, but
Yep.
like there's conservation laws. That seems pretty fundamental.
Those seem to be universal, yeah.
Right. And
I think that, by the way,
I
that's the worst. That's the worst. Maybe the best point against Cartwright, by the way.
totally
Uh,
agree. And she never
yeah,
addresses it as far as I can
yeah,
tell. And it's annoying. And yeah, because I'm like, you have all these great critiques. What did you think about the conservation of momentum?
yes,
But
yeah.
so there's a big asterisk. There's a huge asterisk there that we can talk about. That one seems fundamental asterisk. Um, but then there are these other things where so like they seem fundamental, and the more that you have, the more explanatory power that you have. And when you have something like a true law, then I guess you should look for it because you get to explain all these different phenomena.
Hmm.
But if you stop, Cartwright kind of gives this example in How the Laws of Physics Lie. She gives the example of Snell's law, and Snell's law is whenever you have two different media that light goes through, it gives you the angle that the light will reflect and or refract
Yep.
going in between those two media. But she makes a point that there's an asterisk besides that that says this only works for isotropic media. So that basically means they have uniform electromagnetic properties throughout. If they don't have that, then you would have to know things about the media in order to make a proper prediction. And now again, we're talking about the thing's essence and like what the thing is that actually causes the law to happen.
Yeah, it's
So I mean,
capacities that she would say. Yeah.
exactly. So I mean, like right there, we've moved from saying law, well, it's not law. In order for it to be a law, it has to be universal. You can say that's a ceteris paribus, however
Yeah,
you,
Ceteris Paribus. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, law, but then that's not a real law because it's not universal. So now we've moved to this. But the question about laws is, yeah, okay. So we have these conservation laws that they do seem pretty much fundamental. So it's discerning what exactly the laws are. But if we move to causes, part of the epistemic problem of science, because we always have these grand theories of how we think that the world works, and we have this
Hmm.
empirical data of, that support those grand theories. The thing is, though, if we were to move to causes, we can say with maybe 100% certainty that we know what causes a thing. We can say we know what causes a thing way easier than we can say we know the mathematical structure of a thing.
Yep.
Like that's when we start saying things where we can kind of get out of this epistemic hole of science that a lot of people aren't even aware of. Like I would say like the Higgs boson, the thing that was discovered at CERN a few
Hmm.
years ago, I would say that it exists. If people looked at how we figured out that it existed, I would bet that they would be disappointed. Now, there's lots of like contextual reasons why we think that exists. Like all that we saw was we said that if there was a Higgs boson, then it should decay into these two photons. And these two photons we knew the energy of pretty precisely, although it would change depending on the details of the theory. We just saw those two photons with enough confidence to say that's not a coincidence.
You basically inferred it. Yeah.
You more or less inferred it. And I'm not
Yeah.
I'm not putting into question quantum field theory, like the scaffolding that was built by the theory, the things that were verified to make this one prediction, to make this kind of, I don't know, maybe to some people dubious experimental observation. I think it's solid. Like it's definitely, it's very unlikely to be wrong. Like it's
No, no,
99.99%
but
right.
that makes that's basically Cartwright's point, isn't it? That we are able to make these to infer stuff
Right.
in terms of science because we have this sort of preconception that things have determined powers and capacities and the
Right.
narrow range of powers. So, and that's why we should expect a narrow range of results
Right.
to come out of them. Uh,
Exactly.
and that's so I'm not sure if you know that much about David Hume and sort of neo-Humean theories of natural law of the laws of nature and all that.
Yeah, I know a little bit.
So,
I
so,
read it.
Hume famously had this argument against this type of inference in nature.
Right.
So the easiest way to put it is something like you can't be certain that the sun will rise
Right.
tomorrow,
Exactly.
and because you're only kind of inferring it from past experience, but
Yeah.
there's no necessary reason the sun should rise tomorrow. Well, that's still very famous in some philosophical circles, and that way of thinking, which is they call it now counterfactual
Right.
thinking to analyze natural laws.
Hmm.
But what one of the things that Cartwright is saying is that that's not how scientists think, and
Right.
science is not possible within that broader worldview.
Hmm.
What scientists sort of presume is that things have inherent capacities, and those capacities lay down a range of possibilities
Right.
and what you should expect. And
Right.
sometimes it's not just you should expect, they follow from them necessarily. And that's the issue here. So within the Humean world, there's no necessity. Everything is contingent. So the sun rising
Right.
tomorrow is purely contingent. There's no
Right.
necessities because you cannot infer a necessity from past experience. That's what he would say. Because there's no essences, let's say, that there's no natures in his worldview. But within this Aristotelian worldview, things have natures, they have essences. And because of that, they have let's say, a form that is actualizing matter, and in doing that, it is actualizing a narrow range of possibilities.
So I guess this would be, yeah, this is like the final cause. This is actually what it's
Basically, yeah,
going towards. Yes, because that's how you can tell what possibility it's going to actualize because it has this nature that tends toward this thing.
yeah. I
Whenever you
think
see that, you don't necessarily see, you don't, whenever you see that, you don't see this abstract sea of facts. You actually
yes.
see how they're connected and how their natures, yeah, cause one another. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
That was, I think, it took me a long time to understand final causes.
Right. Because
I don't know.
the thing is it took me a while. I don't know if I'm 100% there, but I mean, yeah, it's interesting because it had a very practical role for Aristotle. It's
Hmm.
literally just if what you whenever you actualize, you're actualizing a certain potential. So
Hmm.
the fact that an efficient cause actualizes some potential means that there was a final cause. Like otherwise, there's
Yes,
no reason for an efficient cause to line up with a final, yeah, with a certain
yes.
actualization of that potential. Right.
That's basically it.
Right.
What for me it was very difficult to get it because I was as a philosopher, you in the analytic sort of Anglophone tradition, even though my formation was kind of mixed, but either way,
Right.
uh, in this tradition, you think in terms of possibility and possible worlds, and that's how you think.
Right.
And this way of thinking basically is kind of free for all. So let's say in possible worlds terms, you have a rubber ball. This is from Edward Feser, this example. You
Hmm.
have a rubber ball,
Hmm.
and there is certainly a possible world in which you throw it down and the rubber ball bounces all the way to the moon.
Right.
There is it's not metaphysically impossible for this to happen. There's no contradiction.
Right.
Within an Aristotelian view, that's kind of absurd
Right.
because it's not within the
You
potencies
don't have, yeah, you don't have the
of the
material
rubber
for that to
ball.
happen. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
It's not within the potencies of the rubber ball for it to bounce all the way to the moon. So, what this picture of the world gives you is a world in which things are kind of delimited already.
Right.
Things have a
Right.
narrow range of possibilities. Or
Yes.
let's say you have full range at the material level, but then things
Yes.
get more and more actualized and they get more and more, their possibilities get narrowed down.
Right.
And that's, I think, and that's what Cartwright seems to be doing in my case. That is the a sort of preconceived way of thinking that you need in order to do science. You have to assume that things have a constant and kind of essential behavior.
Well, yes. So this is really interesting because so the asterisks that I said about the
Yeah,
conservation laws, this kind of brings them up.
yeah.
Because the conservation laws, like conservation of momentum, conservation of energy, conservation of angular momentum, they're derived based on symmetries of space-time. So
Hmm.
Emily Noether, one of the most important mathematical physicists of all time, she said that every conservation law comes from a certain symmetry of a certain type of space-time. So I think she lived in the, I don't remember, early 1900s, late 1800s, before Einstein's general relativity, where we weren't really thinking about curved space-time. So we thought that space-time was kind of this one of Jacob Switchenberg, he has this great
Yeah.
book called Physics from Symmetry, and he makes this remark. He says, we used to kind of think that space-time was kind of a passive thing. Um, but with special relativity, and then even more with general relativity, we learned that it's very much this active thing, like it reacts to the type of matter that's on it. Well, okay, so Emily Noether doesn't know this at the time. She thinks that everything kind of works in flat space-time, and she derives, conservation of momentum. So conservation of momentum for her comes from the idea that if I have a particle and I move the particle, there's certain things that have to be conserved. And if you
Mm.
just make those two assumptions, then you get conservation of momentum. Conservation of energy says that if I have a particle and I move in time and I still have the particle, there's another thing that has to be conserved, and we call that energy. And angular momentum is based off rotational arguments. Um, but she's making these arguments in flat space-time.
Mm.
Okay, so like you and I said, the conservation laws seem pretty fundamental. They seem like real laws. Well, this is actually true until you get to curved space-time, because if you have certain curved space-time manifolds, you could have a particle that would move through space-time. There would be no other force acting on it, and it would have a momentum here, and it would have a different momentum here. There's no
Yes.
longer this translational invariance that we get um,
Mm.
conservation of momentum from. So this is also interesting for you because you said that you were interested in unifying, talking about the conservation laws, kind of talking about unifying through saying that there's different types of forms, but many different
Yeah,
types of matter, or sorry, many different types of forms, same type of matter, I think.
yeah, yeah.
But this is interesting because okay, so here now the conservation laws have now become a property of your space-time. You see what I'm
Mm.
saying? If you have flat space-time, you have conservation laws. If you don't, you don't have conservation laws. Now, you can still have conservation locally. Like, if you only consider a particle in a very small part of your very curved space-time, then okay, you still have conservation, but now it's a property of your space-time. So it almost seems like we've moved back to an essentialist powers viewpoint where we're saying
Yeah.
that these conservation laws are a property of space-time. And if I guess if it were the case that we could only live in flat space-time, then you could say that they're universal, but it's not. Like even those are in question. They're way more universal and you can assume them for most cases, even with highly curved space-time. All your quantum field theory stuff that you have to do that have to assume these conservation laws, since it happens on such a small scale, you can
Hmm.
assume them. But generally they're not universal symmetries. They become these local symmetries, and again it's a property of the thing. And
That's very
so
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, it becomes really interesting because if you're like in your project where you're saying that there's many different types of forms and maybe this underlying matter that underlies all of them, well, it would seem like all these conservation laws just depend on what you call matter. Like, what
Hmm.
is real matter? If you're on flat space-time, then momentum is actually a type of matter because it has to, survive all kind of changes.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
No,
It's
no,
interesting.
that's very interesting. That is very interesting, and it's also that would give uh Cartwright an even more forceful argument.
Right, but she
The,
never addresses it. I
yeah, yeah,
mean,
yeah.
she's
No,
like right there.
I'll have to. There are so many Cartwrightians in philosophy now that someone has to have looked into that.
If you find
I'll
anybody,
look
yeah, I
into
would
that.
love to see it because yeah,
Uh,
I'm trying to be more thorough about this before I write this. I already have these kind of written in drafts, but I'm just trying to make sure. Yeah, I don't know. The other
no,
thing,
I will look that up. But
yeah,
just one thing is that I think So even when physicists talk about fundamental and fundamental laws, and there's all this debate in the sciences because laws of nature seem to make sense only in physics and maybe chemistry. There is no
Right.
really, there's no laws of nature in biology. Some people have tried to argue that natural selection is sort of a law of nature, but
Right.
it doesn't have the same features.
Right.
And one of the and I think that is to be expected within this Aristotelian world. It is expected that the more fundamental is more law-like in the
Right.
sense that it has it's not as determined, let's say, and you should expect that the clauses, the ceteris paribus clauses that you have to apply at the lower level are much simpler than the ones you have to apply at the biological level, where
Right.
complexity is so big, let's say.
Right.
And that's one of my problems with Cartwright's idea of the world as a sort of dappled world
Right.
is that her dappled world is too flat. It's basically a flat surface, and each science has a different domain of the surface, and it looks into that.
Right.
I think that she's generally right, but her broader picture is wrong. And the reason it's wrong is that the world seems to be way more hierarchical than dappled.
Precisely.
So there seems to be a sort of hierarchy, and that actually makes her case stronger because within that hierarchy, you should expect laws of nature to behave the way that she describes them
Right.
behaving. So the laws of physics should behave with very few ceteris paribus clauses, and the laws of biology, if there are any, should be basically be impossible. But if you derive some, they should have all these clauses that make all sorts of preconditions for them to work
Right.
because there's all this emergence of stuff already.
Right. I mean, yeah, and so that's a great point because I was having a problem when I was trying to work through these laws of nature thing, which is it was the principle of least action. Because the
Yep.
principle of least action, if you can really define the action, and you run into this side problem where you can have these laws that may be fundamental, but the likelihood that you'll be able to the likely so in order to do the principle of least action, you have to have a precise quantity for the kinetic energy and potential energy of your
Mhm.
system. So you run into this other problem where how can you precisely quantify the kinetic and potential energy without making abstractions? Like maybe I'm going to call this ball a sphere, but it has slight perturbations.
Yep.
This is a side issue as well with laws in general. And Cartwright kind of makes this point. But
Yep.
the thing about the principle of least action is that it does work at every scale. It works at you can just use the principle of least action and do all the physics. It's just about defining what is kinetic energy and what is potential energy in these systems. And then you'll run into some different well, if you start from a Feynman version of the principle of
Mhm.
least action, you can do this. But
Right. That
yes.
is great because that has to do with the point I was making before that you should expect a continuum of physical causes.
Yes.
That's what I meant. That you should expect that what is true at the lower level uh, is sort of it's continually true across levels. It can be
Right.
determined in different ways. Let's say it can be put to work in different ways to use
Yes.
a very uh, and specific
Yeah, because there are
way of
some
talking.
there are some
But there should be a
instances.
continuum. Yeah.
Yeah, there are some instances, like for instance, if you have say that I have a system here and I've done the principle of least action, and I know how the
Hmm.
system's evolving in time. If I have another thing that comes in and hit the system, well, my system, this math that I did over here actually can't handle that. I have to restart now.
Yes.
So there's this thing where yeah, whenever you have something that's not in your system or you've broken the symmetry, because that's really why this works, is because it has a certain symmetry, and
Hmm.
something outside your system came in and destroyed the symmetry. Same thing can happen on layers of complexity where you can kind of break symmetries. This is actually how we describe it. It's really interesting, and the details of that are a bit above my pay grade. I mean, symmetry in physics gets quite crazy, but it's really interesting. But anyway, so the idea of the the principle of least action, I was like, well, this seems fundamental.
Hmm.
And I actually because I'm a big fan of Ed Feser. I've read Aristotle's Revenge through like, I don't know, 3 times or something like that. And I couldn't
Yeah.
find an answer to like, what do I do with the principle of least action? I actually emailed Ed Feser and he
Okay.
responded to me and he said, I'm trying to make a case for the powers view of kind of laws of nature, like saying that happens from Aristotelian essences and stuff. and he said, well, there's nothing wrong with certain powers being common to lots of entities. Like that's not a
Yes.
problem. And so, yes, exactly. If you think about this hierarchical view where you have certain powers that are common to all entities, like mass, like everything has a mass. Well,
Mhm.
all fermions have a mass. Well, I guess well, okay.
Well,
All
if you
particle
think
things
in
have them.
energy terms, let's say
Right.
you should expect you think that energy is quite is analogous to prime matter. So you should expect that everything that applies to energy also applies in higher levels because it sort of
Right.
composes everything.
Yeah.
Uh, so
And
I think that with
Aquinas makes this view because he says that, from my understanding, he says that like when you actualize something from prime matter, he's like the prime matter is still there in a way.
yeah.
That's from my
Uh,
understanding. He
uh,
says something like that.
Yeah, he's talking more about proximate matter probably
Okay.
there.
All right.
Yeah, but either way, that's the idea, and I think it's just that I'm very interested in how in giving this framework of the world as a whole,
Right.
and I just don't think that in order to argue that it's not to argue against mechanism and this sort of physicalist. What's the word that Cartwright uses? Cartwright calls it, I think it's imperialism. This idea that physics is the sole science that will give us any knowledge, any form of
Right.
real knowledge.
I
Uh,
think she calls it a fundamentalism, maybe.
Fundamentalism as well,
She
yeah.
talks about like law fundamentalism. Maybe that's
That's one of the terms, but
okay.
she has one that's like more normative, more provocative as well.
Okay.
Either way, uh, you don't have to accept that. Of course, that's wrong. But in order to reject that, you don't have to reject the idea that what physics is describing is, I keep using the word continuous, but let's say disrupted, but is never disrupted at the higher level. You can have emergence of complexity without needing to expect some kind of physical gaps to happen. And that's one of the reasons why Aristotelians are not Cartesians. We are not dualists.
Right.
Like one of the problems with Descartes and other people that still think in very dualistic Cartesian terms is that they made matter its own actual thing. And then they argue that, but then we have something like consciousness on the
Right.
side. And they can't make them work together because from the beginning they were separated. So within that worldview, I guess you need to argue that for consciousness and a physical body to cohabitate or cooperate, you need some form of like physical gaps, maybe. But that's not the Aristotelian view of things. Like in the
Right.
Aristotelian view of things, they are always interrelated.
Right.
There's no matter without form,
Yes.
and that means that you should not expect any kind of physical gaps in order to be able to argue for the novelty of the higher level. The
Right.
higher level can be completely novel. It can have all these sorts of properties that you shouldn't be that you couldn't predict from the lower level, but that once you see them, you can track down at the lower level.
Exactly. Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, it happens
yeah.
all the time. I mean, I one of the basic examples I use is say that you had a thermodynamic system, and one of the
Mhm.
properties of a thermodynamic system is the microstates, the particles that make up the thermodynamic system are typically seen as chaotic.
Yeah.
Um, if you just zoomed in and you were looking at the particles of the system, you would have such a hard time trying to figure out the symmetries or the conservation laws of the system. It would be borderline impossible. But if you zoom out and you say like, oh, this is a particle, these are particles in a box, so this is a gas, basically, everything becomes really easy. Like
Yes.
you can talk really easily about these fundamental like macroscopic quantities that are preserved. It becomes super clear. And there's a connection between the two, actually. It's not like one it's not like one totally governs the other. I mean, the symmetries of the whole is more fundamental than the parts there, but
Mhm.
it's not like there's a complete disconnect. But if you're really trying to figure out that system, then zooming out would, be in your best interest. So yeah, it talks
Yeah,
about
exactly.
yeah,
It's the sort of holism
right,
is is just it's incredibly important to the sciences right now,
right,
and you can't understand most phenomena without a view from the whole, a sort of higher level perspective.
right,
Uh, so it's just interesting how this is happening, and it's I think we have. everything, our generation in general, to sort of connect these worlds again
Right.
in ways that would seem impossible just a few decades ago.
Right.
Uh, even for me, when I got interested in philosophy, uh, I I was very much just sort of Hitchens like existentialist. I was reading a bunch of Sartre but and
Oh
all
no.
that. Yeah, and Camus. But I was also a very Dawkins like in my thinking.
Yeah.
Uh, and I thought that everyone thought like that.
Right.
That was the way smart people thought. And
Right.
then I get to college, and during my first year, that was basically just uh, reiterated. I thought, oh yeah, okay, I'm right because everyone thinks within this paradigm. Uh,
Right.
the medievals were kind of wrong, and we have to do metaphysics in a very naturalistic way. We
Right.
have to explain away consciousness and all that. And then in my second year, I started having medieval philosophy classes, and they were surprisingly good. But more than that, it was on. I was um, uh, on a flight the first time I went to the US to
Mhm.
present a paper, and I bought a book a few weeks before, which was Phaser's Aquinas,
Yep.
his small companion to Aquinas,
Yep.
because I wanted to write something on Aquinas for my medieval philosophy class,
Hmm.
and that book sort of opened my mind because all of a sudden all these problems that I had in contemporary philosophy they were either solved or kind of dissolved
Hmm.
by Aquinas, like stuff like the mind-body problem.
Right.
It wasn't a problem anymore. This thing with possibility and potentiality and how they're different, and how if you think in terms of potentiality instead of mere possibility and possible worlds, you solve all these problems already.
Right.
Uh, all that was completely new to me, and it solved a bunch of problems. And I think that and then I discovered that actually in contemporary philosophy, and then I discovered in contemporary science, many people are doing this and are thinking like this.
Right.
But I think that the general public still has a sense that the sciences are roughly mechanistic,
Yeah.
that philosophers are all atheists
Yeah.
or naturalists or whatever.
Yeah.
And they still are, basically, by the way. But even if they're naturalists, they are not naive naturalists, let's say,
Right.
so to speak. They are not naturalists the same way uh, a mechanist in the early 20th century, like a logical
Well,
positivist, was a naturalist.
have you seen the new mechanist movement? Have you seen that?
Yes, which is
It's
not mechanistic at all.
dude.
New
Yes, it
mechanism
is.
is Aristotelian. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm like, I saw this because yeah, part of my goal on Substack is to dismantle mechanism. And I'm like, okay, well maybe, yeah, what's this new mechanism? What'd they do? And I'm like, oh, they're making my
No,
argument for
that's
me.
the best
Right?
example.
Yeah,
You know,
it's so crazy.
Aristotle has this idea of saving the appearances, which
Right.
was mocked by the early moderns,
Yeah.
because they would basically say that Aristotelians have this way of doing science where you always have to save the appearances. So if the sun appears to you to rise in the morning and then uh, go to sleep or whatever in
Right.
the at night. They have to save the appearances and say that that's right, and that's clearly wrong. That's what they would say.
Right.
Well, actually, what I think is happening now is that many naturalists and many physicalists are trying to save the naturalist appearances, and they
Right.
keep using terms like
Aristotelian.
mechanism, or it's just new mechanism. And no, it's not
Right.
new mechanism. And that's not
Right.
mechanism at all.
Well,
You are just trying to save the appearances.
right. Well,
That's just not mechanism.
yeah,
That's forms.
this has been one of my, I think so. I think part of the reason that you have kind of this postmodernist view that's very popular now, it seems to me that, so like the moderns kind of set out this system that people thought would work really well, and
Yeah.
then you realize that it doesn't work. I mean, so an example with quantum mechanics, I've heard so many people say, well, it's just chaos at quantum mechanics. Like we don't understand what's going on. And whenever you have that view, you're like, okay, well, everything's chaos. And it's only chaos. It's only chaos if you're a mechanist. That's the only reason that it's
Yes.
chaos. So, yeah, exactly. If you come back to this, because I always have this, I forget what it's called. Phenomenological conservatism. I kind of have
Hmm.
that
Same.
epistemological view, yeah, where it's like, whatever seems to me to be the case, I'll hold to that until there's,
Yeah.
contrary information. Um,
That
And
was,
the
by the way, one of the things that made me that attracted me to this way of thinking. Like, even in ever since I was interested in philosophy, I always had an aversion to these philosophical systems that were extremely counterintuitive.
right,
So
exactly.
even when I was an atheist, for instance, it was very difficult to me to accept a philosophical system where I didn't exist, where consciousness was just an
Right.
epiphenomena, for instance.
Yes. And
And it's weird to me that people think in those terms because
right.
they basically have to abstract themselves from the world
Exactly.
and then
And
think
this is what
about the
Descartes
world.
does whenever he says I'm gonna extract myself from the
Yes,
world. And the Aristotelian says like you literally can't do that. Like that's not even
yes,
that's
you're
a non
embedded. Yeah.
sequitur. Yeah. And so but I have this phenomenological conservatism view, and a lot of people I think one of the reasons that a lot of people gave that up was because of things like quantum mechanics, where they're like,
Hmm.
it's this extremely unintuitive thing that's happening. And you kind of have to just give up on understanding it. We have these math techniques that we can use to understand that. So I think that's kind of what caused that. Like whenever, like if people I say that I have this view to, people always say like, "What do you say about quantum mechanics?" And I'm like, "Well, if I'm not a mechanist, then I can integrate that into my intuition." And this is another thing as well. Like science, earlier we were talking about the difference between technique and science, and magic and religion and stuff like that. And it seems to me that these days science is much more about technique. I mean,
Yes.
especially in America, I've noticed that. I know that you're across the pond, but I've seen a lot more, I guess what I would consider more leisurely activity, in academia. Like some of my favorite philosophers of science are all across the pond. I mean, they're doing like this
Yes.
really cool stuff. And here, because there was for a while I was considering going out of my PhD in physics and doing metaphysics or philosophy of science, and I
Hmm.
just couldn't find programs that were, like within my grasp, just with life right now, or like things that I really wanted to do. A lot of them
Yeah,
were
you have
across.
to go to the UK. You have to go
Right,
to the UK in this case. Yeah.
right. And so it seems like all of the grants that we get, you like whenever you write a grant, this isn't always the case, but and it kind of depends on which department you're trying to write a grant
Hmm.
for. But typically, a lot of the grants you get because you say that it will lead to some sort of technology.
Yeah.
And whenever you start emphasizing technique over intuition, because like the church fathers would say that intuition is actually the highest form of knowledge because it's a thing where you integrate it into your being. If you think about the symbolic way, if you think of Adam, and Eve as the meeting of heaven and earth, like if like you get to embody these heavenly principles,
Yep.
they become part of you and you can think like that. And so whenever we turn from understanding, which reaches its heights in intuition, to technique, yeah, we're just chasing these. You can just put everything in a machine learning algorithm and get the right numbers out, and then
Yep.
you're all good. And yeah, I don't really think that that serves us. I think that again, you need to have understanding that's true understanding. It's not like black box, you have something
That
that does it for you. But
Yeah, that made me think of something that I think I heard Pajot say one time, but I'm not sure if it was him. But either way, someone pointed out that, of course, we talked about this idea of science as magic in the ancient sense of magic,
right,
but there's also a sense in which science became, or at least it was popularized in a way, as magic in the modern sense of it, as kind of tricking you.
right.
So if you look at these
Oh,
grandiose,
wow.
kind
Yeah, I've
of
never thought about that.
victorious narratives
Right.
about modernity,
Yeah.
what people will say, so people like Steven Pinker, for instance,
Right.
in Enlightenment Now, I think that's the name of that absolutely distasteful book.
Yeah.
But either way, he says that their broad paradigm, not paradigm, but narrative is something like people used to believe all of this
Right.
about nature, or that nature was full of agents, for instance, and that's why you had animists. That nature was full of purposes.
Yeah.
That we were the center of the world, the center of the earth. But then, because we were able to kind of go out of ourselves, we were kind of able to disembody ourselves from our own perspective through the telescope and through all these new technologies. We were
Right.
able to see that that is not the case. That in
Right.
fact, the moon is not a perfect form. It has this is
Right.
what Galileo supposedly
I,
did.
I was talking about this in my history of natural laws, like the development
Yes.
of natural laws, where it's actually because, I think pseudo Aristotle, I don't know if you can,
Yeah.
pseudo Aristotle has a really nice quote where he basically says that everything below the moon is the world of decay and things that are above the moon,
Yes.
is perfect. And actually, the Copernican revolution, whenever we're put into the heavens at that point, like it wasn't the idea that we are the center of the universe. That's not how the medievals thought about it. They thought of
Exactly.
we're now in the heavens. And whenever you see that, we're like, oh, we're in the world without decay. Maybe we can apply these mathematical principles to our
Yes.
world. Yeah, that's what actually happens.
That's what actually happened, but that's not the narrative that was pushed for a long time. So
Oh
the
yeah, no.
idea was basically that you have all this naivete,
Yeah,
and people thought that they were the center of the world, that the sun and the moon or whatever were pure forms or angels or whatever, the stars were
yeah.
angels.
But if you
But
look at
then
Dante's cosmology, where it's set,
that's how
in
it
the
is.
middle of Earth because it's the
Yeah.
lowest point. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, because they didn't get, of course, that this was mostly symbolic. But
Right.
either way, there's this idea that what science did was showing ourselves how things truly were. That
Yes.
they were not like this; they were actually like that. The sun is not rising in the morning. Um, we are actually going round around the sun.
Right. Yeah.
And this is very close to what a magician, in our sense, is doing. He's sort of tricking you, and then he reveals the trick. And what you thought at first was kind of
Oh,
magic and enchanted is then
right.
revealed to have a sort of a mechanical cause. You were
Right.
just tricked. And there's this idea that you still find people that think in these terms, that they think of religion as an illusion, for instance. This
Right.
great illusion that is kind of tricking us in order to make us behave in certain ways.
Right.
This opium of the people idea of religion.
Right.
But what they are saying is basically that science, we were getting tricked, and science showed us the real cause of things.
Right.
But interestingly, I think, and what the new developments are doing are sort of telling us that no, in fact, what you always believed is the case. Of course, it's not the case that the sun goes up in the morning and then goes down.
Hmm.
In a sense, because even with Einstein, we know that it depends on who's measuring it. From what point are you measuring it? Because
Right.
if you're measuring it from the Earth, a lot of calculation on, for instance, I know that in sea traveling,
Right.
boats and all that, they still see the universe as if it's geocentric because
Right.
it works for their purposes.
Right.
Uh, that's how they do their own
Right.
calculations.
Yeah. There's
So
a
there are
sense where
all
you're always the center of your own universe in general
yes,
relativity. Yeah. Right.
there is a sense in which this embedded way of looking at things
Right.
is making a comeback, and not just because we want to impose meaning in the world,
Yeah.
because the sciences themselves are kind of giving us a way to think like people used to think.
Right.
Uh,
Well, this is another thing as well because I've been thinking about this idea of like there's no such thing as subjective and objective.
yes,
Because if I mean, yeah, first of all, you can I mean, it's true. Einstein shows that everything's dependent on your reference frame, but everything that we say is objective is always a subjective measurement. Like
yes,
people will say, okay, Mount Everest is, I don't know how tall Mount Everest is. It's 5,000 meters tall. It's probably 10,000 meters tall. And they'll say that's objective. And I'm like, it's 10,000 what? Meters. Okay. Who
yeah,
made up meters? Like that was kind of a connection between heaven and earth where we decided this is a meter and someone had to measure it. I mean, you have this idea of I think subjective and objective is I mean, there's true and false. Absolutely, there's true and false. I believe in that. But
no,
this idea
yeah.
of subjective and objective to me is really just a way to discount human experience or the idea that you can get to anything non-empirically.
Yes,
And
and
it,
that was, and they were always sort of intermingled. They were always
yes,
seen as joined together. The person you can track this down, I think, very easily in philosophy. It was Galileo who created this absolute distinction between the two.
what did he?
When he
I've been
says
looking
that
for that.
stuff like qualities. So
Right,
science should focuses on whatever you can measure,
right,
whatever you can mathematize, and that's
right,
basically quantity, motion, uh, forces.
But
whatever
again,
you can't mathematize.
just because you can mathematize it does not at all make it objective.
No, yeah,
If anything, it makes it more subjective.
well, that's what I think people then did. I think people
Right.
made that
Yeah, that
uh,
jump.
that jump
Yeah.
because the other things that he didn't consider. Oh, Galileo didn't do this, didn't make this an ontology, by the way. He thought this was
Yes.
methodologically relevant. This was efficient in methodological terms, but he didn't think this was ontologically true, by the way.
I
People then
thought
did this.
I always thought that he did because he always makes the claim about the book of nature. He says like if you do not understand math, then you will not understand nature.
No, yeah, yeah, I guess he has a point there, by the way. But the thing is that I don't think it was supposed to be this totalizing view of nature that
Right.
then mechanists made it out to be. It
Okay.
was mostly a methodological reduction of stuff in order to do science,
Right.
not the picture of the world. Either
Mhm.
way, what he left out when he said that we should look at and consider quantities only is the quality. So
Right.
smells, conscious experiences, color, which is a big problem until this till this day in philosophy, philosophy of color, because
Right.
we may know everything about the wavelength of light and how it generates color, but that's still very different from experiencing color and
Right.
actually seeing a color. Uh, and it seems to me that when with all this genealogy, it's very difficult to track it all down. But
Mhm.
whatever started with Galileo, one of the great objectives of modern science was to get what Thomas Nagel calls a view from nowhere.
Exactly.
Uh,
Right.
uh,
But
to
it
get
doesn't
to be
exist.
this perfectly outside first
Yeah.
person, let's say, no, a third person
Yes.
object um, uh, guy. But
Right.
that's
But
impossible. Like the third person is always first personal.
this is the other thing though, because whenever Descartes says he realizes that he doesn't have any certainty, and then
Yeah.
from that he kind of despairs because he realizes like, yeah, he doesn't have this view from nowhere, this ultimate view. But
Hmm.
Aquinas, he always says that you're connecting universals and particulars.
Yeah.
And to him, God would know everything. So and you have a hint of connecting these universals to particulars. So you get some real knowledge. But there's this understanding that, yeah, okay, you only have your perspective, so it could be wrong. Like you could learn stuff wrong. Like that's a possibility, but it's not necessarily scandalizing. You know what I
Yep.
mean?
And
Uh,
that's also why, just to wrap this up, I have to leave in a minute.
okay.
But it's just that one of the things that also attracted me about Aristotle was this idea that we are rational animals, and both aspects of the definition are important. You are both rational, but you are also an animal.
Right.
And something that happened in post Cartesian philosophy is that some people started to think that we are sort of disembodied minds,
Exactly.
that the body is accidental. You're not really an animal,
Yeah.
and that makes possible this view from nowhere becomes
Exactly.
easier
Yes.
because if you don't have a body, if you're not embodied in any way, it's easier for you to conceive of something like a purely third person perspective,
Right.
something like a view from nowhere. But it's
But this,
yeah,
if
yeah,
I
you
could
go.
interject real quick, the other
Yeah,
thing
yeah.
that does, and this will tie in this connection with symbolism as well, because
Hmm.
the idea, Aquinas and Aristotle had this idea that humans are the only things that really hold what we call knowledge. Like
Yeah.
we're the only ones that hold it. If you have that view, then some things that pop up in your mind, like symbolism, for example, which is just pure intuition. It's basically like
Yes.
human formed intuition. Pajot will make the point that symbolism is the way that your brain thinks. It's kind of the
Yeah.
way that it instills these metaphysical principles. Only when you have that kind of view can you make these symbolic arguments and you be seen as like a
Yes.
crackpot. You know what I mean? Where
The,
I made that comment on my notes on Substack where I'm like, I need another thing for my crackpot symbolism so that, people will still take me seriously. But
yeah, yeah.
I'm only having this problem because you're supposed to have this objective view from nowhere, But if you take intuition as being maybe a real thing, like you can actually connect heaven and earth in these symbolic ways, then that becomes okay. And you could be wrong, of course,
Yes.
but that doesn't mean that it's all void.
I think uh, I, I- I'm I am not a let's say, reactionary at all in
Yeah.
many things. That's why I'm not I don't really like to call myself a Thomist because I disagree with a bunch of Thomists now. And one of the aspects where this manifests itself, I guess, is that, for instance, there was a lot of uh, reaction against Darwinism from even from Catholic circles at the time, even though it was more amicable to it than the Protestants in general.
Right.
And I think that one of the reasons for that is because Darwin kind of showed that we are animals.
Right.
We are part of nature and we evolved.
Right.
And that idea that we are animals was scandalous in the 19th century. And the main reason for it, I think, is because we were perceived and Christians absorbed this, and they basically became the other end of the mechanistic caricature of the universe, that we are just minds. We are sort of angels, basically.
Right.
But within the Aristotelian view, it shouldn't be a surprise that you are an animal. You are an
Right.
embodied consciousness.
Right.
And
You just have an
also,
extra
no,
part.
no,
For Thomas, you have an immaterial part to your soul, which makes it
yes,
rational. Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, of course, that's important. But the idea, animality is always there.
Right.
And if you have this view, even in evolutionary terms, I never really understood these evolution theorists who believe that religion is a sort of um, it's not like a myth. They use the term an illusion, like a great illusion that evolution created so that you would be able to survive or whatever.
Right.
If evolution doesn't track truth, if it doesn't actually track reality as it is,
Right.
why should we even believe that we now evolved in ways that make us able to do science?
Right.
This is something that Plantinga
Right.
says. He has
Yeah.
this evolutionary case against naturalism, but
Right.
it makes perfect sense. Like, and within this Aristotelian view, it makes sense as well that your body should be able to capture the world. You should be able to see things as they are. You should be able to capture forms.
Right.
And even in evolutionary terms, you should expect that, let's say that evolution is true. I'm just presupposing that. But if it is, we should have evolved in ways that track the world. Because
Exactly.
how are you able to survive
Yes.
with illusions only? If
Yep.
everything you're perceiving is an illusion, you would be dead
Right.
fast.
Yeah. I mean,
uh,
that's kind of the dog. That's what evolution claims to do is like you're evolving to reality. You're making
yes,
yourself better able to deal with reality. And so you're like,
yes.
yeah, we're converging on something, it seems.
And if that's the case, then we have all the tools now to kind of finalize the sort of revenge, but with
Right.
new eyes as well. I don't think that's why another problem that I have with some Thomists is that they just sort of want to come back to Aquinas. They think, oh, you kind of figured it all out. We just have
Right.
to come back to it. And I don't think that's the best way to approach it. Maybe the
Yeah.
best way to approach it is that he was right about all sorts of stuff, but there were reasons why people rejected him. There are
Right.
reasons why scholastics themselves rejected Aquinas,
Right.
and everything that followed from that, we should be able to integrate everything that happened after him. Oh, the scientific revolution, mechanism, and all that
That's
in
why I
a
think that's
constructive way.
right. That's why I was saying earlier, I was like, because I've been trying to just use Aristotelian categories, but I think long term I should make a neo-Aristotelian category. It's very similar. I think it'll be more
Yeah,
similar to Aristotelianism than it will be mechanism, but yeah, there's a couple of caveats where we need to make, and yeah,
yeah. And are you Catholic or you're
yeah,
Orthodox?
Catholic,
You're Catholic? Yeah, yeah, same. And that's another thing, I guess, that because within Catholic circles, Thomism is still very prevalent.
right?
But we are living through an age where we have, and I know that, for instance, you're really into Maxim as a confessor. I saw your
Yeah,
text on that. I'm really into the Greek fathers as well.
yeah,
And we live in an age where we have access to all sorts of texts that Aquinas didn't. And some
right.
of them are, for instance, the Cappadocians. Aquinas never read Maximus directly, of course.
I don't think that's true actually.
Oh, for
I
real?
don't think that's true. Yeah, if you look at I was reading this
He read
part.
Dionysius, I knew that.
Yeah, I was reading a part of the Summa the other day. I don't remember exactly which part, but if you look up the question where he asked, "Is God the proximate cause of all things?"
Okay.
In there, actually, all the questions that he's answering in that article are pretty much a summary. Like I could have just posted that same article instead of writing my treatment of Saint Maximus, because he says, is God the origin of all things? Is God the final cause of all things?
Yes,
And is
yes.
he the proximate cause of all things?
Yeah, yeah.
And he answers in the same way that Maximus does, but in his scholastic
No,
manner.
no. What I mean is, I don't think he materially read him. It's
Maybe.
probably just they sort of course, they will converge on many things. And
Yeah.
Aquinas is better read as a sort of the last of the Platonists, the
Right.
last Neoplatonists, in my
Yeah.
opinion. Uh,
I
but
don't know
either
because
way,
they always say the thing. Yeah, I don't know that much about the translation, but I don't know if you've ever heard this saying, and I don't know how true it is, but they always say Aquinas knew everything that there was. He was the last person to know everything that there
yes.
was to know, and
Yes,
so
exactly. In this time, but
right, maybe
so this is interesting. Even Aristotle, for instance, the West basically lost all of Aristotle's texts until
right.
I think 60 years before Aquinas,
Yeah,
and they came from the Arab world.
yeah.
And I'm not sure, but I think that even when it comes to Plato, Aquinas only had small sections of the Timaeus
Okay,
and one or other dialogue. So what I
okay.
mean is that the actual text, he had a bunch of stuff to read, of course, but we have much more now.
Right,
And
yeah,
even Catholics right now, we have people that were not available during the Middle Ages, like Origen,
right,
uh, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, and all that,
right.
all these
And I guess
thinkers.
just like back then, whenever Aquinas got Aristotle, he was doing a work of synthesis. I guess even now we
Yes,
just we just have a bigger work of synthesis, especially
yeah,
with
to
like
do.
modern science and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, that's exactly my point. We
Yeah,
should be trying to create a bigger and much complete synthesis instead of naively going back to whatever we think was a sort of a paradise lost of the Middle
right.
Ages, of
Yeah,
the Great Scholastic Age or whatever. It's
I,
much more exciting to think that we can build something new that is still grounded in whatever great insights they had.
yeah. I think that's a good point. I guess that's a good point to end on.
Yes.
But yeah.